In 1812, Napoleon Bonaparte was still Napoleon, kind of. The man who crowned himself Emperor of the French, who smashed coalitions left and right, who rewrote Europe's borders like a bored cartographer doodling. He stood at the peak of his power. His empire stretched from Madrid to Moscow, from Hamburg to Naples. But it wasn't the unstoppable juggernaut of Austerlitz anymore. Beneath the surface, cracks were forming. Spain was bleeding his army in guerrilla war. Britain still ruled the seas. And Russia, well, Russia was pretending to be his ally, while quietly breaking the rules of his economic blockade. In our timeline, Napoleon chose the most self-destructive solution imaginable. He invaded Russia with over 600,000 men, only to watch them wither away to a frost-bitten skeleton of maybe 10% by the time he staggered back out. It was the campaign that broke him, the turning point that made Waterloo possible. But what if he never went? What if Napoleon looked east in 1812 and said, "Non, merci"? That's our divergence point. And with one choice, history tilts. The baseline, Europe, in 1812. Let's set the board. France, dominant on land, with perhaps the best trained professional army in the world. Britain, dominant at sea, impossible to invade, but vulnerable to economic strangulation. Russia, technically Napoleon's ally after the Treaty of Tilsit in 1807, but increasingly unreliable, trading with Britain on the sly. Prussia and Austria, humiliated but simmering, waiting for Napoleon to slip. In our world, he slipped in the Russian snow. In this alternate world, his Grande Armée never marches east. So what changes? Scenario 1. The army survives. Skipping Russia means Napoleon preserves the single greatest military machine Europe had ever seen. No 500,000 men frozen, starved, or abandoned. No loss of veteran marshals. No collapse in morale. So when the Sixth Coalition inevitably forms, Britain, Prussia, Austria, and Russia again, Napoleon meets them at full strength. The difference is staggering. In our reality, the Battle of Leipzig in 1813, the so-called Battle of Nations, crushed him. 3 days of fighting, hundreds of thousands of troops, and Napoleon lost because he couldn't replace his losses. But with an intact Grande Armée, Leipzig might not be a defeat. It might be a draw, or even another Austerlitz. Momentum matters. Without the Russian disaster, the aura of invincibility lingers, and coalitions that expect a dying giant suddenly find themselves facing a titan in his prime. Scenario 2. Britain feels the squeeze. Napoleon's great obsession was choking Britain with his continental system, a trade embargo banning British goods across Europe. In our history, it failed because Russia cheated. Grain and timber slipped north. British merchants found new markets, and smuggling thrived. But if Napoleon never punishes Russia with invasion, he can keep pressuring them to enforce the blockade. Even partial compliance matters. Britain's economy was heavily dependent on European trade. Losing it put real strain on industries and finances. Imagine food prices rising, merchants panicking, and the Royal Navy sailing triumphantly across the seas, but unable to feed their own factories at home. Would Britain collapse? Probably not. But would it hurt enough to change their strategy? Absolutely. Instead of financing endless coalitions, Britain might find itself on the defensive, scrambling to keep its empire afloat. Scenario 3. The Americas tilt. Here's where it gets weird. If Napoleon keeps his power intact through the 1810s, the ripple effects cross the Atlantic. The Latin American Wars of Independence, Bolivar, San Martin, all those revolutions against Spain flourished partly because Spain was weakened by Napoleon's wars. A stronger France, prolonging continental chaos, could delay or reshape those revolutions. And the United States? Fresh from its War of 1812, it might face a Europe where France is still the dominant power. Maybe Napoleon looks at New Orleans again. Maybe he flirts with Caribbean expansion. Maybe the Monroe Doctrine never quite lands. A Franco-American rivalry in the 1820s isn't impossible. But Napoleon still has problems. Let's not get carried away. Skipping Russia doesn't erase the fundamental flaws of the empire. Spain, the The Peninsular War was still a bleeding wound. Spanish guerrillas, backed by Britain, were grinding down French troops year after year. Logistics. Occupying Europe isn't free. Armies must be fed, horses replaced, garrisons maintained. Tax burdens caused resentment. Nationalism. The very ideas Napoleon spread, legal equality, nationalism, meritocracy, inspired Germans, Italians, and Poles to dream of independence. That genie doesn't go back in the bottle. Demographics. France's birth rate was stagnating compared to Prussia or Russia. Over time, sheer manpower tilted away from Paris. Industry. Britain was industrializing faster than anyone. Steam, coal, mechanization. Those long-term advantages would eventually outpace French armies, no matter how brilliant. In short, Napoleon could delay defeat, but could he prevent it forever? Probably not. The alternate 19th century. Here's the fascinating part. If Napoleon holds on longer, the 19th century looks unrecognizable. German unification. In our timeline, Prussia eventually unified Germany in the mid-1800s. Under prolonged French dominance, that might be delayed or reshaped entirely. Imagine a federation under French influence, with Napoleonic law as its foundation. Industrialization. Paris, not London, could emerge as Europe's industrial and financial capital. French railroads, French factories, French engineers, a Franco-centric modernity. Language. French was already the language of diplomacy. With a longer Napoleonic reign, it might edge out English as the universal second language. Today, we might all be conjugating verbs instead of memorizing phrasal verbs. Colonial ripple. Britain's empire still grows, but slower. France might retain more overseas influence, reshaping Africa and Asia's colonial future. So, what's the final picture? If Napoleon never invades Russia, he doesn't lose 500,000 men to snow and starvation. He keeps his army, his prestige, and maybe wins a few more years, even a decade, as Europe's master. His laws and institutions entrench deeper. French influence spreads wider, and the world of the 19th century could tilt French instead of Anglo. But empire is a marathon, not a sprint. Spain still bleeds him, nationalism still festers, industry still shifts power, and demographics still matter. Napoleon might die on his throne in Paris instead of an exile's rock in the Atlantic. But the forces pulling Europe apart, economic, cultural, technological, don't vanish. They only wait. History is brutal that way. One bad campaign destroyed him in our timeline. Avoiding it buys him time, but not eternity.